Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're asking a huge question, one that really gets to the heart of our ancient history. When did people first reach Sahul? Ancient Australia and New Guinea.
It's a question that keeps changing, doesn't it? The dates seem to shift.
They really do. And it's fundamental, right? It tells us so much about how ingenious early humans were, these incredible journeys they made.
Absolutely. A massive undertaking.
For a long time, there was this one key archaeological site, pointing way, way back, an incredibly early date.
The one everyone talked about.
But now genetics is stepping in and we're really shaking things up. It's creating a real scientific showdown, DNA versus digging.
It really is. You've got these two powerful lines of evidence, archaeology and genetics, telling apparently different stories about the same event.
Exactly. So that's our mission for this deep dive, trying to untangle this debate. What's the evidence on each side? What are they arguing? And what does it all mean for how we picture our deep past, especially getting into Sahul?
Yeah, it's a fascinating puzzle. Let's get into it. There are definitely some surprises here.
Okay, so let's start with the genetics. The case for a later arrival in Sahul. It seems to build on something pretty solid, right? Something about Neanderthal.
That's the bedrock, yeah. It's pretty much accepted now that all modern humans whose ancestors came out of Africa carry a bit of Neanderthal DNA, around 2%.
Right. It's like a genetic echo from our deep past. We all carry it outside of Africa.
Exactly. And the really crucial thing is that recent studies, really cutting-edge work, they seem to show there was only one main period of interbreeding between Neanderthals and us, anatomically modern humans.
Just one. So like a single point in time, roughly.
Well, a single period, they've pinpointed it pretty tightly, somewhere between about 43,500 and 51,500 years ago. And importantly, this happened after modern humans had left Africa, probably somewhere in the Near East or Europe.
Okay, so that's like a genetic time scan.
You could think of it that way.
So, hang on. If the ancestors of people in Sahul have this Neanderthal DNA, and they do, right? Same amount as others.
Yep, equivalent amounts.
They don't then, would they? They must have gotten to Sahul after that mixing event happened. Is that the logic?
That's the core implication. If the mixing happened around, say, 50,000 years ago at the earliest, and Sahul ancestors have the DNA from that mixing, they couldn't have been isolated in Sahul 65,000 years ago. The genetics just don't support that earlier date.
Wow. Okay. That seems pretty direct. So what does that tell us about how they got there, the routes and timing?
Well, it constrains the timing significantly. And it's not just Neanderthal DNA either. There's another piece, Denisovan DNA.
Ah, the other archaic human group.
Right. And we find Denisovan ancestry maybe 2 to 5% in populations across Southeast Asia, and especially in indigenous Australians and Papuans.
So they picked that up along the way, too.
It looks like it, yeah. As their ancestors moved eastwards, they encountered and interbred with Denisovans. There seems to have been one major pulse of this Denisovan gene flow identified around 46,000 years ago.
Okay, so that also fits within that post-Neanderthal mixing time frame.
It does. It adds another layer supporting a migration into Sahul sometime after roughly 50,000 years ago.
And there's more, isn't there? Something about a single source.
Yes, exactly. Studies, like one by Malik and colleagues back in 2016, argue that the modern human ancestry in Sahulians doesn't come from some hypothetical, really early wave of humans out of Africa that didn't mix with Neanderthals. Instead, their main genetic ancestry seems to come from the same big migration event out of Africa as other non-African populations, the one that did mix with Neanderthals.
So it strengthens that idea of one major later expansion.
It does. It paints a picture of a single successful dispersal that eventually reached Sahul, rather than multiple independent earlier attempts.
Okay, so if this genetic picture is right, what does it mean for those older claims, like finds in China suggesting humans over 70,000 years ago, or that 65,000-year date for Australia itself?
Well, it challenges them directly. If those dates were correct, you'd expect those early populations not to have Neanderthal DNA because they would have left Africa and reached Asia or Australia before the main mixing event occurred.
Right.
And if that were the case, those earlier groups must have died out completely without leaving any genetic trace in people today. Which is possible, but we also haven't found distinct archaeological evidence that clearly separates such an early group from later arrivals.
And you mentioned some of those archaeological sites themselves are being questioned now.
Yes, that's a really interesting part of this. The genetic evidence kind of prompts a reevaluation. And when you look closely, some of those very early archaeological claims often have uncertainties, issues with dating or maybe the context of the finds.
Like things getting mixed up in the soil layer?
Exactly, like potential sediment mixing or fossils perhaps shifting downwards over millennia, making them look older. O'Connell and others have pointed this out for several sites.
Can you give an example?
Sure, there's Tampaling in Laos. Fossils were found, but there's debate about whether they were naturally deposited there or perhaps washed in later. Their context is a bit ambiguous.
Okay.
Or Lida Ajur Cave on Sumatra. Some teeth were found, dated quite early, 60,000, 70,000 years ago. But the site itself is known to be disturbed, the dating has inconsistencies, and really most researchers agree those teeth need to be dated directly to be sure of their age.
So without those really early, potentially problematic sites.
The reliable evidence for modern humans being in Southeast Asia, let alone all the way over in Sahul, before about 50,000 years ago starts to look, well, quite thin.
Okay. The genetic case seems really strong. Almost feels like case closed, right?
You'd think so.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets really interesting, because archaeology has its own powerful evidence, and it throws up a major roadblock to that neat genetic timeline.
Oh, okay, the counterpoint.
Exactly. And the big one, the site that really stands out, is the Madjedbebe rock shelter up in northern Australia.
That's the 65,000-year-old site.
That's the one. They found a whole range of stone tools, even pieces of ochre used like crayons. And the dating, using luminescence techniques, consistently pointed to at least 65,000 years ago. It was, and still is, a hugely significant finding.
So direct evidence of human activity dated quite convincingly at the time, way before the genetic timeline seems to allow.
Precisely. It's a direct conflict. But Madjedbebe isn't without its critics, especially regarding that dating.
Because of the ground conditions you mentioned, sandy soil.
Yes. The argument is that in very sandy deposits like those at Madjedbebe, it's possible for artifacts to gradually move downwards through the layers over thousands of years. Bioturbation, things like termite activity can mix things up.
So older sand grains used for dating might end up next to younger artifacts, where younger artifacts could sink into older layers?
That's the concern. It could potentially make things look older than they really are. And this has led to some pretty detailed critiques looking at the site's geology, the dating methods, the archaeology itself, and how it squares or doesn't with the genetic story.
So how do we reconcile that? A major archaeological site versus this strong genetic signal?
That's the million-dollar question. It's tough. Peter O'Connell, one of the researchers looking closely at this, made an interesting point. He said it doesn't automatically mean the Madjedbebe dates are wrong. But, he argued, if they are right, then maybe those 65,000-year-old people aren't actually the direct ancestors of modern Aboriginal Australians to any significant degree.
Ah, so maybe an earlier group that didn't contribute much genetically later on, like we discussed before.
Potentially. It's one way to try and bridge the gap, though it raises its own questions.
It's fascinating, though, that Madjedbebe seems to be such an outlier. What about other sites in Sahul? Do they fit the genetic picture better?
They really do, and that's what makes Madjedbebe stand out even more. If you put it aside for a moment, almost all the other well-dated early human sites in Sahul cluster much more recently.
How recently?
Mostly between about 43,000 and 54,000 years ago. Pretty much bang on the time frame suggested by the genetics.
Wow. Can you give some examples?
Sure. There's Mololo Cave on an island called Waigeo, just off New Guinea. A recent find there, a piece of worked tree resin, was dated to just over 50,000 years old. Fits perfectly.
Okay.
And then in Sulawesi, Indonesia, not technically Sahul, but on the likely migration route, they found what's claimed to be the world's oldest narrative cave painting, dated to 51,200 years ago.
Incredible. So these support that northern route into Sahul, around that 50,000-year mark.
Yes, the evidence seems stronger for that northern pathway. People have looked for evidence on the southern route through islands like Timor, but so far nothing reliably older than about 44,000 years has turned up there.
And you mentioned these dates line up with other events, too.
They do, which adds more weight. This time frame, around 50,000 years ago, seems to coincide with the disappearance of Homo floresiensis, the hobbits, on the island of Flores.
Ah, right. Maybe modern humans arriving played a role.
It's a strong possibility. It also matches the timing we talked about for the main Denisovan gene flow into Sahul populations. And interestingly, it's around the time geneticists estimate that the ancestors of New Guinean and Australian populations split from each other.
So a whole cluster of events around that 50,000-year mark.
Exactly. It suggests a period of significant change and movement, likely triggered by the arrival of anatomically modern humans in the region, fitting that genetic timeline.
This brings us to some bigger picture ideas, doesn't it? About human behavior. I know some researchers, Allen and O'Connell, talk about a sort of Paleolithic revolution.
Yes, they propose this idea of a relatively narrow window starting around 50,000 years ago, where modern humans really kick things up a gear.
Take things up how?
Well, they argue this period saw fundamental innovations, a big shift in stone tool technology, the middle to upper Paleolithic transition we see in Europe and elsewhere, the explosion of incredible cave art, the appearance of groundstone tools, and crucially, for reaching Sahul, developing new kinds of boats or rafts, sophisticated marine technology needed to cross open water.
So a package of innovations that allowed this rapid expansion.
That's the idea. They argue this enabled modern humans to displace archaic groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans and spread into really diverse, challenging environments like Sahul relatively quickly.
It's interesting you say quickly. Was the move into Sahul fast compared to other migrations?
Apparently so, or at least the Sahul data suggests a very rapid colonization once humans had the necessary toolkit. Compared to the slower spread across Europe earlier, this speed is something of an anomaly that needs explaining. That's part of their revolution idea.
But that revolution concept, it sounds neat, but I imagine it's debated. Not everyone agrees things suddenly changed.
Oh, absolutely. It's quite controversial. Other researchers, like Graucut and Seri, push back hard. They argue that many of these revolutionary behaviors actually appeared much, much earlier in Africa.
Like tens of thousands of years earlier.
Yes, and not necessarily as a sudden package deal, more like a gradual accumulation, appearing and sometimes disappearing in different places at different times. So less of a sudden revolution, more of a long-term evolution of complex behavior.
Okay, so the revolution idea itself is under scrutiny. And what about the archaeologists who are maybe skeptical of relying so much on these genetic models, these molecular clocks?
That's a really important point of tension, too. You hear archaeologists like Peter Veth asking valid questions. Can we really be sure about the assumptions built into these genetic dating methods, the molecular clocks? Are they precise enough to definitively challenge well-dated archaeological evidence?
It's the challenge of comparing two very different types of clocks, right? One based on DNA mutations, the other on radioactive decay or sediment layers.
Exactly. Each has its strengths and potential weaknesses. And some archaeologists offer different interpretations of the existing evidence. Adam Brum, for instance, looks at that 51,200-year-old cave art in Sulawesi and suggests, well, maybe the people who made that art belong to the same broader cultural group that did reach Sahul earlier, perhaps closer to that 65,000-year mark. He basically thinks the evidence for the earlier date is still out there, waiting to be found. He's quoted as saying, "It's coming."
So the debate is alive and well. Where does that leave us right now, if neither side is definitive?
It leaves us in a fascinating but uncertain place. The honest answer is that the inconsistency means we can't be completely sure yet. Both the genetic story and the archaeological story have gaps.
Right. The genetics relies on models and mutation rates, and the archaeology has issues like Madjedbebe's dating controversies.
Precisely. There's no single piece of evidence right now that overwhelmingly proves either the pre-50,000 year or the post-50,000 year arrival date beyond doubt.
So what's needed then? More digging, more genomes.
Both, ideally. And crucially, more collaboration between the fields. Geneticists and archaeologists need to work closely, integrating their data, understanding the limitations of each other's methods. That's really the only way we're going to untangle this complex history.
It really highlights how difficult it is to reconstruct the deep past, but also how dynamic the science is. New finds could change everything.
Absolutely. It's a constantly evolving picture.
Okay, so that wraps up our deep dive on when humans first reached Sahul. It's clear there's this real tension, isn't there? Powerful genetic evidence suggesting a later arrival after about 50,000 years ago, clashing with some compelling, though debated, archaeological evidence like Madjedbebe pointing much earlier.
A classic scientific puzzle.
It really is. And for you listening, think about this. It's more than just arguing over a date. It touches on the incredible story of human migration, our ancestors' adaptability, their ingenuity in crossing seas and settling continents.
Truly remarkable journeys.
And when we face conflicting evidence like this, from DNA and from the dirt, how does that force us to rethink our assumptions? Not just about the past, but about how science itself works, how we build knowledge.
It's a process of refinement, of challenge and response.
Exactly. And the big question remains, what discovery will come next? What might shift this whole narrative again, maybe even next year? It's a story still being written.